Hello, I'm Maxie with Maxie Makes. Today I'd like to show you a modern version of a very classic quilt, the Dresden plate. The fabric placement in this quilt makes it look like there are two separate wheels, but that's not the case. I'm going to show you today how to make this quilt in any size, along with a lot of tips and techniques that'll help you with your regular quilting too. Let's get started. My daughter and I designed this quilt for her fabric line called Reminisce. The quilt behind me on the wall is made from those fabrics, but today I'm using a different fabric line that she designed called Sweet as Honey, and here are a few of these fabrics that we're using in the quilt today. The pattern is a free download from Art Gallery Fabrics website, and you can order a kit in either colorway from my website. You're going to follow the directions in the pattern to cut the strips, and you're going to sew them together in the order that the pattern states. I like to sew my strips together with a serger. Look how neat that is on the back. When you finish, there'll be no threads to clip. Everything will be nice and neat. I use my serger all the time for strip piecing. If you set your blade and your needle 1/4 inch apart, you get a perfect 1/4 inch seam every time. You know, sometimes we can get into just as much trouble at the ironing board as we can at the sewing machine, so let me show you a few tips that I've discovered. First of all, when we press a strip, we don't want to distort that seam line. We want to keep it nice and straight, because however you press it is how it's going to be from now on. So I've drawn a straight line on my ironing board using a Pigma pen and a yardstick, and that gives me a great edge to line up my seam edge on that straight line and set my seam with a little bit of steam. And then I want to press the seam open. Now I've laid the fabric on top that I want the seam allowance to be pressed toward, so all I have to do is flip this top strip up and now press the seam open. Make sure you don't have any fabric hiding in that little seam allowance there. Make sure it's open all the way. Press all of your strips into pairs, 2 by 2, and then sew them all together, and we'll be ready to cut these into wedges. Okay, there's a word that strikes fear into the heart of every quilter, and I'm no exception. That word is math. But don't worry, I've got it all figured out for you here. All right, a circle has 360 degrees, and let's say we want 40 wedges in that circle. 360 divided by 40 is 9. How do I know how to cut a wedge that is 9 degrees and include a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides of the wedge? I don't want to go there. I don't want to do it. I might not want to make this quilt. Enter Marilyn Doheny's ruler. It's a 9-degree wedge ruler. It has 1 inch line markings along the length of it, and you can cut wedges for Dresden plates up to 24.5 inches long. So that's what we're going to use to make this quilt. I am going to show you how to cut with it now. I'm going to place the line that is numbered 21. I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera or not, on the first seam. So we place it across the width of the strip set with the 21 on the first seam, and you want to just look across the ruler and make sure all of the marked lines are at least parallel with a seam. Parallel, more math, right? Remember 2 railroad tracks, they're parallel. So I have these lines looking good, and I'm going to make this cut. And then I'm going to move around to the other side of the table. I don't want to really disturb my ruler, and make another cut. Great. That's our first wedge. We want to remove that from the strip set and put it in a stack and label that wedge number 1. Now we're going to rotate the ruler. I didn't flip it. I rotated it. Pick it up, rotate it around, and lay it down again with the line 21 on that first seam. Do you notice I put a piece of washi tape right there against that line? That helps me to quickly be able to lay that in place and not have to search for my line. Now if you sewed and pressed neatly, you'll be able to just put that cut edge on your previous cut edge and make your cut again. It's okay if you have to trim that from both sides though. Just shave off a little bit of it if you need to neaten it up. Now this wedge is called wedge number 2. Let me turn it around. See how the fabric placement makes those look different? We would rotate the ruler and make another cut and continue the whole length of the strip set. You're going to get about 15 wedges from this strip set. Just keep them in stacks of wedge number 1 and wedge number 2. You're going to make 3 strip sets and cut all 3 of them into wedges. All right, now you should have 20 wedge number 1s and 20 of wedge number 2. And we're at the sewing machine now, and we're going to stitch across the top of the wedges so that we can create this tip or this point for our Dresden plate. Let me show you how we do that. I like to chain them through the machine. It's fast and easy that way. You can't do this on the serger. You have to use your regular machine. But here is our wedge. We're going to fold that right sides together, and we're going to stitch across the top like so. Stitch from the cut edge and not from the folded edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And just feed them in. Feed all 20 in at one time. This is what we call chain stitching, so that when you're finished, you're going to have a little clothesline of wedges. Now this doesn't have all 20, but I just sewed a few together so you'd get the idea. We're going to cut them apart and go to the ironing board again. Now we're ready to press the wedge. The seam that we sewed across the top needs to be pressed open. Let me show you what I've done with this Dritz Easy Hem. This is a piece of metal, and I've had this for years, but they still make them and they look exactly the same. They haven't changed because you can't improve on something that's already perfect. But I did take it and draw a diagonal line from the corner right there, and I just used the 45-degree line on my ruler to do that. And what that does is it allows me to place it in the tip of the Dresden wedge and line up my seam perfectly in the center. I want my seam lined up with the line that I drew. I press it open with my finger, and then I can touch it with the iron a little bit, and then I'm ready to turn it right side out. And my other tool that I love to do this application with is the Clover press tool, and that has a really sharp tip on it and allows me to press the tip of that point. I'm going to insert this again and line up the seam with the line that I drew, and this time I'm going to press it really well and remove that, turn it over, and spray it with a little bit of Flatter. This is a product called Flatter. It's a starch alternative. We don't really like starch in our quilts, but this is a really good plant-based product with no toxic ingredients in it. And it gives you a nice crisp point. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, we're ready to sew our wedges together now. We're going to work on 1/4 of the quilt at a time. So there's math again. That means we're going to work with 10 of our 40 wedges at one time. So I have laid them out here, and I've alternated wedge number 1, 2, 1, 2, and so on until I have 10. And I'm going to sew these together in 2s again, just like we did our strips. I'm going to fold them right sides together, or place them right sides together. And the neat thing about this is that the seam allowances are going to lock. I'm not sure if you can see that on your camera there or not, but you can feel it even with your fingers, because the seam allowances in this wedge are pressed toward the narrow tip, and in this one they're pressed toward the wide. And that happened automatically as we flipped our ruler when we cut the strip set. So you need to place a pin there, or at least I do. There are pinners and there are non-pinners in the quilting world, and I am a pinner. So I'm going to pin each intersecting seam down the length of the strip, and then I'm just going to sew that together. And I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to begin up here at the fold of the tip that we created. You do want to back stitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. That's very important for this quilt. So I'm going to use that feature that I love that allows me to get perfect placement of my needle on this machine, and I'm just going to sew. Okay, now this seam is sewn, and we're going to press that open at the ironing board, and I have a really neat little trick for that too. But before I do that, I can sew these two, these two, these two, and these two, and then go to the ironing board and press all those seams. Let's go do that now. Now we're ready to press our 2 wedges that we've sewn together. We've sewn them in pairs. We need to go to the ironing board at this point and press this seam open. Have you ever gone to the ironing board and pressed a seam only to disturb or mess up the seams that are on the other side of the seam that you're working on? Well, I have the answer to that. If you just lay your piece flat and press, that's where you get into trouble. But I have this wonderful tool called a strip stick. And it's padded, it's not wood. I don't know what's in there. I'm so tempted to rip it open and just to look at it and see, but I don't want to not have it. But it's I don't know, almost 1 inch thick. You just lay it on your ironing board and you put your seam right on top, and your other seams are down below the stick. So then when you press it like this, the only place that your iron touches is your seam. And it's pressed perfectly. We'll turn it over and we're going to hit it again with a little shot of steam. And now this is ready to sew to another pair. This is a finished section of our quilt, and remember, you're going to make 4 sections like this. Let me show you the back. We have our seams all pressed open between the wedges. Now we're going to place this on a background piece of fabric that we've cut. What you want to do is line up the cut edge of the first wedge with the cut edge of the background fabric. Just line it up perfectly. The pattern tells you what size to cut that square. And make both of these edges. You have to kind of slip it and slide it until it's just so. That looks great. So you can see that I have it in place and the edges are even. And now we need to pin. We're going to applique these coral colored tips to the background piece. And you can use whatever method you like. I'm going to show you in just a few minutes my favorite method though. So you're going to put a pin in each tip. You're also going to pin down both of these sides and across this curve right here. All right, let's go applique this in place. Now I'm ready to applique the Dresden plate onto the background fabric. We have it pinned in place, and I'm going to share my favorite applique method with you. You use whatever method you like, but here's what I like. I like to put a clear polyester thread in the top, and for that my favorite is Superior Threads Monopoly. and I set my machine up for an applique stitch. My machine has a special stitch that takes several stitches on the background fabric and then just jumps over and catches the fold of the applique fabric. So I have decreased the width also on that to 1.25, and that will just barely catch the fold of the fabric. It looks pretty much like a hand stitch, especially with the clear thread. So you're just going to stitch this down all the way around, pivot at the point, rotate it, and continue stitching. You can get so precise with this stitch, and I like to have the open toe foot on there. It helps me to see exactly where my needle is gonna go next. Now I'm not going to stitch any further, but I'll let you look at this. I've stitched this point, and I would continue to stitch all of them, and then this next step is optional for you, but I like to do this. I turn it over and trim away the background fabric from behind the Dresden plate. It's totally your choice whether or not you do that or not. Do that for all 4 sections of the quilt, and then we'll be ready to sew those together. We're almost finished with our quilt now. When you have 4 sections sewn, you're ready to sew those together. I have these 2 sections sewn together right here in this seam. And remember I mentioned you had the option of cutting the background away from behind the Dresden plate? You can see here where I went in with scissors and cut that away. So I just have the Dresden plate here. Let me show you on this one down here. You might leave it in and you're going to have the solid background there. The result of that will be I have an opening right here in the center, but you would have solid fabric right here. Now we still need to applique a circle in place there, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. Now we're ready to finish the circle on the quilt. To do that, we need to cut a circle out of freezer paper large enough to cover the opening. So I don't give you an exact measurement for that because we all have different seam allowances. I just say get to this point and measure that and add about 1/2 inch at least to cover that. So I have this freezer paper circle that I've made, and I know that it's going to cover that. These seams haven't been sewn yet, but when they have, it'll fit nicely on there. You can get your compass out again if you want to get back into math to make your circle. You can go find a dinner plate that covers that and just draw that on your freezer paper. Use whatever method you like. I used my Silhouette Cameo cutter to cut this perfect circle for me. And then you're just going to iron the shiny side to the wrong side of your fabric. I chose to use the fabric for this circle to be the same as the border fabric that I'm going to use. So that's what I'm doing here. And you just iron that in place. Then you need to trim around the outside edge of the paper less than 1/4 inch. Trim it maybe 3/8 of an inch, maybe even less than that. And I've done that on this circle right here. Can you see that I have just a little bit of the fabric extending beyond that? I've already pressed this in. What I'm going to use is a little dab of glue from a glue stick. And you just I'm putting this on the edge of the freezer paper, just a few inches at a time, and then you just roll that over onto the glue and do that all the way around the circle. You could also use a raw edge fusible method to do this circle if you want to, but since we have turned under the edge of the Dresden tips, I think it's nice if we actually have this edge finished on this as well. Now, let me show you how nice this circle is. It's perfect. And the edges are turned under. So I'm going to use the same method for this as I did for stitching these tips down with the clear thread. I'm going to pin it in place, and I'm just going to stitch around the circle. Won't that be nice? And then you can see my border selections here. I have an inner border and an outer border, and those will be provided in our kits. If you would like to purchase a kit for this quilt either in the Sweet as Honey fabric line or in the Reminisce line that we showed earlier, you can visit our website. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you've enjoyed learning how easy it is to make a Dresden plate. And until next time, God bless and happy quilting.